The history of military aviation is replete with examples of aircraft that seemed like a good idea at the time. They make up a fair portion of the aircraft I cover here. But while some of these were genuinely clever ideas that were either just before their time or else just fell by the wayside, most seem to be a case of the powers that be, whether that was the customer or the design team, just getting it wrong. And today's aircraft, the North American O-47, is a great example of this. In 1934, the United States Army Air Corps, the USAAC, started giving serious thought to their next generation of Army Corporation aircraft, designated as observers by the service. This role required the aircraft to be capable of supporting troops on the ground, conducting roles like spotting for artillery, tactical reconnaissance, and air-to-ground liaison. At the time, the job was being done for the USAAC primarily by a couple of aircraft types, the Douglas O-38 and the Thomas Morse O-19. These were typical biplane aircraft of the time, fabric-skinned, limited armament and low performance. But with the leaps and bounds occurring in aeronautics, especially in engines and construction methods, these two suddenly looked rather dated, and the USAAC figured that, along with the rest of the air fleet, modernisation of the cooperation branch required a fresh aircraft that employed these developments. Seems like a logical enough conclusion. There had been some limited purchases of new aircraft, primarily the Douglas O-31 and O-43, of which handfuls were acquired, but the USAAC thought they wanted something better. In September 1934, the board convened to explore proposals for a new observation aircraft, concluded that the one offered by the General Aviation Manufacturing Corporation best suited their requirements. Though orders for two types were issued, the Douglas O-46 and the recommended GAMC O-47. About this time, GAMC was rolled into North American Aviation, who took over the development of the prototype XO-47, which first flew in late 1935 with the company designation of GA-15. The aircraft was a thoroughly modern design for the day. Made of all-metal construction with unbraced cantilevered wings, the XO-47 was fitted with a Wright Cyclone 9 radial engine that produced 850 horsepower, as well as having the advanced feature of a retracting undercarriage. The aircraft had a three-man crew in what was a spacious cockpit for the day, composed of pilot up front, observer in the centre, and a gunner protecting the rear of the aircraft. Because of its mid-wing design, which restricted the downward view for the observer, a large window was placed in the aircraft's somewhat bulbous belly. To utilise this, the observer would fold his seat and lower himself down into the compartment, where he could see more clearly and use a camera for reconnaissance missions. Testing by the service revealed some engine cooling issues, but they were impressed enough to issue an order for 174 O-47As for service with their observer squadrons, with an initial order in 1936 and a follow-on order in 1938. This production variant had a more powerful version of the Wright Cyclone, which generated 975 horsepower, and with this the service aircraft had a top speed of 221 miles per hour. Armament was limited to a single pintle-mounted 30 caliber Browning machine gun for the rear gunner, and another was fixed in the starboard wing for use by the pilot. The USAAC started to take delivery in 1937 and ran trials on using both floats and skis on their new observer, and in 1938 ordered 74 more of an improved variant, the O-47B. This featured an even more powerful engine that produced 1,060 horsepower, boosting performance slightly, plus additional fuel tanks for improved range. By 1939, the USAAC was equipped with probably the most advanced observer aircraft in the world. And it was basically useless. When the war broke out in 1939, the United States military was a keen observer of how things went, with most attention being given in historical studies to the lessons they drew, rightly or wrongly, for fighter combat, bombers, or else armoured warfare. But one lesson they seem to have got right was that an aircraft like the O-47 was a complete waste of time. In 1941, the US Army conducted a series of field exercises to examine their doctrine and equipment in light of what the war in Europe had taught. It was apparent that the O-47 just didn't do what was required of it. It was too slow to perform photo reconnaissance missions in the face of any sort of opposition. In fact, it was a complete sitting duck. But it was also too quick and bulky to conduct artillery spotting effectively. In addition, and probably most daft when you think the aircraft was supposed to support ground forces, it pretty much required a proper airstrip to operate on, meaning it couldn't really perform air-to-ground liaison either. The desire to implement new technology in the US Army's observer aircraft had produced a lemon. It was recognised that reconnaissance aircraft would need to be fast so as to outpace enemy fighters, meaning that specialist conversions of mainstay fighters became the principal platform in this role. While for ground support/artillery spotting, the Army went with much smaller and simpler aircraft like the Piper Cub and the Stinson Sentinel, which could operate successfully alongside their ground force counterparts. So kudos at least to the USAAC for realising their mistake before they committed the O-47 to the fight, though some unfortunate crews did probably see combat. Some O-47s were deployed to squadrons in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded, and though I haven't found any accounts of what action they may have seen, I suspect they would have been depressingly easy kills for Japanese fighter pilots. The rest of the fleet was swiftly withdrawn from active squadron service and saw brief use on coastal anti-submarine patrols in the continental United States and as target tugs, before many finally became instructional airframes at mechanical schools. I mean, they were a modern design comparable in construction to current aircraft of the day, so at least they could do that job well. It is interesting to compare the fate of the O-47 to its British equivalent, the Westland Lysander, especially considering the different ways that the two types are remembered to history, with the Lysander celebrated while the O-47 has largely vanished into obscurity. Because in reality, both aircraft had very similar ideas in their origins, a modern Army Corporation aircraft to replace the outdated ones already in use. And I think it's safe to say that the US Army's realisation on the failure of the O-47 before it saw combat was by observing what happened to the Lysander in its intended job. It got slaughtered. During the Battle of France between 10th of May and 25th of June 1940, of the 175 Lysanders deployed by the British, 118 were lost. This effectively spelt the end of the Lysander in its originally envisaged role of Army Corporation, but the aircraft proved a boon for the special operations that would become the British main activity in Northern Europe until June 1944. For this, the Lysander's ability to land in and take off from small rough fields proved a winner, and they were heavily engaged running covert agents into Nazi-occupied Europe. But for its success at this, the Lysander would have gone down in history as the same as the infamous Fairey Battle. Unfortunately for the O-47, decent STOL capability was not something that it was apparently designed for, which makes me suspect that the core reason for its failure is the same criticism that was aimed at the Lysander after its terrible showing in the Battle of France. It had been designed by the Air Force with no real thought of what its job was and with no consultation with the ground forces on what they required from the aircraft. Obviously, newer, bigger and faster were better, and with the USAAC in the 1930s really beginning to stretch their proverbial wings and assuming a much larger role in American military planning, it would seem logical that the bosses there wanted something much snazzier than some geriatric biplane. Considering that geriatric biplanes performed the role of observer/liaison for several air forces throughout the entire war, that would seem to indicate that the USAAC didn't really get what was being asked of them, or maybe didn't really care. To put it bluntly, the O-47 was designed to Air Corps ideals, not the Army's, which is probably why they built an aircraft for Army Corporation that needed an airfield to operate from, and was too big, complex, and rather remarkably, both too slow and too fast for the job it was required for.